think you joined us for our big presentation a few weeks ago. So good to see you again. So I have a presentation that goes in a little bit deeper into both the outreach and the results of our survey and some important lessons learned that I picked up and hopefully can pass on for future endeavors. So I am going to share my screen. And okay, you should be able to see a PowerPoint.
We can.
Perfect. All right. So this is a small group. I think we can keep things pretty informal. I'll start walking through the slides. Feel free to interrupt me, or you can type your question in a chat, and Katie Rose, maybe you can stop me to ask it. And I'll also have a few natural points for us to pause and kind of discuss what some of the results were from this particular aspect of the larger project. Okay, so with that, we will dive in. So as you all know, the larger project that I was a part of focused broadly on planning a sustainable tree canopy for Durham. But the section that I'm covering today is the resident survey that we implemented. So the overall project assessed the current conditions of Durham's tree canopy and developed plans to help Durham reach its tree canopy goal of 55%, which we've all heard a lot now. And we wanted to incorporate this resident survey to inform Trees Durham's advocacy for tree management changes, as well as to acknowledge the well-established research that resident buy-in for a given city project greatly impacts its success. So before we get into the survey specifically, I wanted to contextualize this piece of the puzzle and just kind of remind all of us how it fits together. So here are the larger project findings, which resulted in these recommendations. So we recommended overall that anyone working on Durham's urban tree canopy should plant trees along streets and streams, plant trees in urban areas, and preserve trees in suburban and rural districts. So this survey, along with the other two sections of the project, resulted in this hotspot map, which shows the areas of Durham that stand to benefit the most from the services that trees provide. So the services, as a reminder, that we tested were lowering air pollution, lowering extreme heat, lowering flooding from storms, and lowering instances of crime. And of course, if you want to learn more about this map, I think that my partner is presenting on May 20th to discuss more about how these maps were built and how the prioritization of those different services were implemented here. So our survey, though, the topic of today's presentation, tried to understand resident attitudes about the current tree canopy and resident opinions on the future urban forest. So we asked 5 key questions in the survey, which you can see here. And through these research questions, we wanted to capture what residents value about trees in terms of tree benefits, but also resident experiences of the existing trees in their neighborhoods, as well as resident preferences for what types of trees they prefer and where they want to see more of those planted. So we really wanted to understand how are residents experiencing the trees today and what do they want in the future. So today's discussion is broken out into 2 sections, outreach and results. So here's an overview of how we approached getting the survey into the community. We started internally with the project team, which was made up of our Duke faculty advisors, as well as the 3-person student team and Katie Rose. From there, we held 2 focus groups to do some deep dives into resident opinions and to finalize the survey. We surveyed folks for 1 month in person and online, and then for the last month or so, we've been sharing results through a series of presentations. Regarding our social network interviews, we wanted to understand who is already in the space of tree canopy management and community engagement. We wanted to understand who those people and those organizations work with and who do they talk to. So I held what are called key actor interviews with these 4 groups to better understand the social networks that we might have access to and where we as the project team might have gaps. So from the Urban Forestry Division, I learned who the city partners with to attract volunteers for tree planting projects, as well as other information around specifically creative ways that the division has met its goals with pretty limited resources. The Hayti Heritage Center director generously shared her perspective as a community leader and on behalf of the space that hosts numerous community and cultural group meetings. Trees Durham is the one who first connected me to the Partners Against Crime groups, which, if you're not familiar, they're regular meetings that are held across the city for concerned residents to share information, primarily about safety, and you'll see those come up later. And then finally, the project team itself had some loose and tight social connections, including a relationship with Watt Street Baptist Church, who, along with the Hayti Center, would host our focus groups. So these social network interviews informed who would agree to share our survey and ultimately who our respondents would be. So before we shared the survey widely, we held 2 different focus groups in Durham, one at Watt Street Baptist Church and one at the Hayti Heritage Center. These focus groups served 2 functions. One, we were able to test how residents value the 4 tree benefits that we were interested in: air pollution, heat, flooding, and crime. And 2, we had the chance to work closely with residents to revise the survey content, its language, and its format to make sure that it was understandable and accessible to other Durhamites. So you can see here how the 2 groups ranked these tree benefits. Both groups agreed on their #1 ecosystem service, that lowering extreme heat was the most valuable benefit. But you'll notice that the Hayti Center focus group ranked lowering crime much higher than Watt Street. And we'll come back to these results later in the presentation. But based on feedback from these folks around the ecosystem services and around the survey writ large, the draft survey was revised, translated into Spanish, and then went live for the month of November 2019. Here, I wanted to share a non-exhaustive list of the organizations who we identified during the social network analysis and set of interviews that agreed to share our survey either online or in person. And I do want to note Trees Durham also shared online. We invited anyone that we surveyed in person to also share the survey online, but there wasn't confirmation, there wasn't an accountability mechanism to see if that occurred or not, so it's not captured here. The PAC groups are the Partners Against Crime groups that I mentioned before, and those occur across the city on a regular basis, so we were able to attend one for each sector of the city. And as you can see, the groups we engaged were a mix of civic, faith, and environment focused. In the case of the in-person surveys, we typically, just so you have an idea of the process, we typically joined a meeting of these groups and had around 10 minutes on the agenda to introduce the survey and the broader project, and then give folks time to complete the survey on paper. They could also ask any questions of, typically it was me, but a couple times it was my colleagues who were implementing the survey. And so this was a chance for us to help clarify questions and make notes of things that might be confusing for our analysis later.
Hey, Grace.
Yeah.
When you're figuring out how to do the online survey sharing, were you specifically looking for a wide demographic? Like, did you categorize different areas and say like, hey, we would like to hit like African American communities, and so therefore we need X, Y, and Z? Like, how did you decide where to do the survey out?
Yeah, that's a great question, because obviously and we'll talk about this a little later, that, you know, this was an unfunded research project, so we were working with limited resources, and we did want to be thoughtful about our approach so that it could be as inclusive as possible. To that end, the partnership with both Hayti and Watts were really beneficial because they're plugged into communities that are demographically diverse, from a socioeconomic status, from a status of race and ethnicity, as well as spatially. They work with or directly serve a number of residents from across the city, and were able to connect us to other groups. So they were very important stepping stone groups. So Hayti, for instance, is the group who put us in touch with the Veterans for Benefits and Justice group, who is a group of predominantly African-American, mostly men, veterans who meet on a regular basis to discuss their interests. I'll also mention like Comunidad de Durham, you know, is an organization that specifically works with Durham's Hispanic and Latino community. So we tried to engage and pull from a representative group of potential respondents. You'll see later that pulling from a representative pool does not guarantee a representative sample. So that's, it leads to one of the lessons learned. But yeah, thank you for the question. I do want to mention too, in all of these cases, we kind of to that point, we had Spanish and English surveys available, but notably we did not have Spanish translators at any of our in-person survey efforts. So this is a good segue into the outreach plan discussion and some of the lessons learned around this outreach. So I want to pause and go over a few big things that we learned, and also check in with the other folks to see if there are any other questions. So these are the three big lessons learned that I came away from this effort around outreach. And the first is that I think any group who wants to embark on inclusive community engagement has to address project team limitations. So in Durham's case, the city is quite segregated spatially. And our project team reflected that. Our project team was predominantly white, middle class, and our social networks did not reflect the demographics of Durham, even as we tried to mitigate this by engaging community leaders and experts in the field of urban forestry. So to what I was just saying, we recognized the challenges of being a team that was not representative of the area we were trying to understand, and work to mitigate it, but it wasn't enough just to have a representative sample, or a representative pool, I should say, of potential respondents. The other limitations to the project team were just limited time, personnel, you know, one person managed the full life cycle of this engagement, and compensation, potential for money. So this whole effort was unfunded, which was likely limited in the ways that we were able to engage and the amount that we were able to engage with folks. Second, I think that a more successful effort would have identified relationship gaps early on in order to more effectively address them. So in our case, no one on our team was confident enough in their Spanish speaking skills to translate during in-person survey efforts. So we scrambled a bit to find someone who was willing to translate, again, with no compensation. And this impacted our outreach to specific non-English speaking groups. So you probably noticed that we surveyed a few faith groups, and but one that we missed out on was the Catholic Church in Durham. And this is because by the time we got translators lined up, many of the churches in the area had moved into like saints festivals and other celebrations, and didn't have time for community engagements that reconciled with our own time frame. So this mismatch of timing and progress to relationship building leads us into the final big lesson learned. And this one is around time, that it really is one of the most valuable investments. Our team's social networks were demographically homogenous, and with more time and a better understanding of the gap between these networks and the residents of Durham, I think we could have invested in building community level relationships, building rapport with local individuals and groups to better understand their perspective, their priorities in the urban space, and how everyone involved can win by participating. So we didn't want this survey to be an extractive exercise where we took information from residents without their opportunity to benefit. And I don't think we did that, but avoiding that came at the expense of not properly engaging key groups like Spanish speakers and longtime non-white residents, simply because we didn't have existing relationships in place to build on. So these were the key learnings for our group, but I'm curious if the folks on the call have any questions around the outreach plan.
If you had had more money, how would you have spent it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's not one that I've gamed out too far, but one thing that immediately comes to mind is the opportunity to provide things like childcare, or to host an opportunity to survey a group of people at one time and offer things like childcare or a meal or even like a transportation subsidy to help folks get there.
I don't know. I actually was typing just now, so I don't know if that question was the question I was going to ask now. Did you think it would have been possible, or was it in any way conceivable to basically enlist some of the groups that you worked with that you also used as essentially like parts of your snowball sampling strategy as intermediaries who actually would go out and do some of the interviews to actually increase the diversity of your team?
I think that's a great idea. And I think, yes, with time, that's something, time and foresight, that's something that we could have engaged. The two challenges I would throw out there, but they're not insurmountable, is one, we undertook this research under an IRB, an internal review board management regime, which limits the way that we can interact with human subjects and limits who can do so on behalf of the project. So I think that it would take it would take thinking about this at the beginning and having folks in mind at the beginning that we could formally integrate into the project from an IRB ethics review board perspective. But I do think it's possible, especially if those relationships were already in place with a few key individuals that we could turn to more quickly, or either that or having a longer time frame where we were able to have kind of a relationship building phase and then a revisiting of the IRB. Yeah, that's a good question though.
Makes sense.
Great. So I want to touch on results, but I'll sprint through a couple of these slides because you saw them just a few weeks ago. So I want to just cover that we received 670 responses over the course of a month from across Durham. And as a reminder for the legend here on the map, the red dots show the nearest intersection to where respondents live, which was a survey question. The yellow circles indicate in-person survey sites, and the blue circles show where the two focus groups were held prior to the survey going live. And I'll just note that we had a number of in-person survey events at the Hayti Heritage Center. So there's one blue dot, but it represents 4 different engagements. So we surveyed residents in person through 8 different engagements, and the survey was formally shared through 11 listservs. Of the 670 responses, 549, so the vast majority, were received online, and 121 were received in person. So you all saw this bubble like a month ago. Who answered our survey? Our median respondent was substantially more white, which you see on the left, had a higher annual income, was somewhat older than the typical Durham resident. So our results are not demographically representative of the Durham population. The typical person who answered our survey doesn't look like the typical person who lives in Durham, despite the fact that we, in theory, pulled from a fairly representative population pool. But we also measured social and health characteristics, and we got a somewhat closer match there. So the number of people who reported living with someone under the age of 18 or over the age of 65 at home is comparable to Durham overall, as is the reported rate of diabetes or stroke. For respiratory illness, data is pretty hard to come by at the city and county level, but in North Carolina, 14% of adults and 18% of children report instances of respiratory illness. So noting these commonalities, moving forward, we use these characteristics in green here to analyze more deeply the answers to our key questions.
Hey, Grace.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, you're gonna like go over this right now, but was it just that you were swamped by like white wealthy people? I mean, how many people do you need in order for it to be significant? And can you break it down based on just looking at people who match the characteristics of Durham?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me offer 2 to 3 points. So the first one is that yes, we were swamped by white wealthy people. And this informs one of my recommendations, that it isn't enough to pull from a representative population pool, because response rates vary dramatically between groups based on access to, access to online resources, a number of things, time to take a survey. And so I recommend in the future oversampling groups that are typically not included in decisions that are made in the urban space. That I think would help mitigate some of the swamping, which is really a good word for it. I think, did you have a second part to your question? Sorry.
Can you not just pull out the subset of people who look the most like Durhamites, or pull out like specifically non-white folks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we could have analyzed we can analyze, and I did, analyze a subset of the responses. One way you can do it that I didn't do is to pull out exactly the number of respondents to give me a perfect demographic picture of Durham. I think that would obviously introduce some bias. How would I randomly choose, which white respondents move into the sample pool? But the other thing that I did do was I did code respondents who marked their demographics as white, and respondents who marked their demographics as something other than white. I coded those separately as like a 0-1, and ran different cross tabulations to test how a non-white respondent versus a white respondent might have answered the questions. There were not significant differences. So that I do think is an important finding, that race was not an indicator in how respondents felt about the services that trees provide. It has to be tempered with the fact that I did not reduce the number within the sample. So it was still, 25% non-white, 75% white, but even within that, responses were not significantly different across the lines of race. Okay. Oh, yeah, I wanted to throw this slide out there to just offer this same information in another format. So this table on the left compares our survey results to Durham. So you can see how close or far off. I mean, we are very far off on the race and ethnicity. That's definitely the worst. I wanted to mention that we did ask folks how long that they had lived in Durham, and the mean residency was 15 years. So one thing that tells me is that between that and the median age tells me that we were not swamped by students. That was not an issue, and that was one that I was somewhat concerned by. So you can see also on the right that I break down the race and ethnicity, and this shows very clearly that our survey overrepresents opinion of white residents at the expense of Black and Hispanic or Latino residents. Our survey sample was representative for Asian residents of Durham and somewhat overrepresentative for folks who identify with more than one. race or ethnicity. It was really our Black and our Hispanic neighbors who whose opinions were not adequately represented here. So again, I won't spend too much time on this because we've seen it once before. But as a reminder, we wanted to help Trees Durham decide where trees should be planted or preserved. So we needed to understand how residents value a tree's ability to lower air pollution, extreme heat, flooding, and instances of crime. We asked respondents to rank these services from 1 to 4, and these are the results. So you'll note that residents marked lowering air pollution as the highest, the most valuable service, and lowering crime as the least valuable service. And I recall that we talked about in our group presentation that we hypothesized there's a number of reasons why lowering crime is the least valued in this case. It could be, it was a very surprising correlation to many of our respondents, and that led in many cases to, folks were unsure that was a correct correlation. So we want to acknowledge that ambiguity there. And of course, when we did test these ecosystem service rankings by health factors, those factors that were more representative in our sample, we see that the results do differ slightly. So these health factors really reflect the values of residents who are most vulnerable to environmental harms that trees can reduce. So this includes, the groups that are included here are the oldest and the youngest respondents. So this is folks who indicated that they were over the age of 65 or in the age bracket of 18 to 24 years old. We didn't survey anyone under the age of 18. This also includes preferences by people who reported living with seniors and or children, and anyone who reported an income lower than Durham's median. And then finally, this includes residents who reported that someone at home lives with asthma or some other respiratory illness. So when each of these social factors are reviewed separately from the overall survey results, the rankings change order, and lowering extreme heat emerges as the most valued tree benefit, which is actually in line with our focus group results, which valued lowering extreme heat more than air pollution.
And the reason you chose those groups is because those are vulnerable populations. Those are people who are most likely to be harmed by heat, air pollution, other things like that.
Exactly. And the reason we, so we specifically, you bring up a good point. We picked our ecosystem services first. And this, I think Alex Vanko mentioned in our last presentation that we picked these tree benefits because they are benefits that can be seen on a map. We can show them on a map, and we can identify where they're being served or not. And then we thought about and we researched who cares about these benefits. And it is folks who are older or younger. They're more vulnerable to extreme heat and air pollution. It's folks with a health history of diabetes, stroke, asthma, and respiratory illness. And it's anyone who is financially stressed and it is living below the median income. So we asked specific questions in the survey to try to understand someone's social situation, essentially, and what their vulnerability was to these benefits when they're not adequately served. And what we found was that folks who are more vulnerable value the benefits differently. So, as a reminder, I just said it, we wanted to understand resident experiences of existing trees, what residents value about those trees, and what they prefer in their trees. So one key question that we asked was, how safe do residents feel in neighborhoods with different kinds of tree cover? And we found that while residents generally feel somewhat safe in their neighborhoods, with respect to tree cover, they feel most safe in areas with well-maintained trees and least safe in areas with dense tree cover or no tree cover at all. And this was a pretty robust conversation that we had in both focus groups about how safety was tied to tree cover, what kind of tree cover offered the most safety, and there were differing opinions. So it was really interesting to get 600 residents weigh in about what they felt, and that no tree cover makes residents feel just as unsafe as unkempt or dense tree cover. And within that, we found that...
Actually,
Yeah.
So, because if I look at that only from the survey results, I would think that that's probably more, that's, you know, that is a correlation but not a causation necessarily. So what was the mechanism, quote unquote, that people in the focus group said, why does tree cover, just the right amount of tree cover, make them feel safer?
Yeah, so we had a general question, and I wish that I had pulled a screenshot for it for this presentation. We had a question about neighborhood safety, and it was a Likert question, which means that respondents chose on a scale of 1, which was very unsafe, to a scale of 5, which was very safe, how they felt in different scenarios. And there were, I think, 5 or 6 scenarios that residents indicated on this spectrum where they landed, and 3 of them were related to trees, but 3 of them were not. 3 of them were how I feel in my neighborhood overall, how I feel walking down my street, and how I feel sitting outside my home. And then the other 3 were how I feel in neighborhoods with dense tree cover, how I feel in neighborhoods with maintained tree cover, and how I feel in neighborhoods with no tree cover.
Right. And in the focus groups, did you also investigate that question?
We discussed mostly the content and the language specifically. And so we didn't ask them to fill out the question themselves. Of course, they might have as respondents, but mostly what we discussed was what are the right categories to test this, and what is the right language, specifically around how do you get at like unruly brush? How do you help folks envision that and think about how they feel about that? So we landed on the language of dense tree cover with our focus groups.
Okay, thanks.
Martin, I'd also say I participated in one of the focus groups, and people felt safer with like street trees, but there was like some specific conversations about really dense trees near buildings, providing people a place to like quote nest in or hide in, and that they felt like abandoned properties. In particular, like one person told a story about how like an abandoned property next door, because there was a lot of dense tree cover, attracted a lot of crime. Right. And so like the questions were like their opinion of what does dense mean, right? So something that's dense to me might be different than something that's dense to someone else. But if you look at the research into actual light density, like how much light penetrates, in areas with really high density at eye level, there is more crime. So it's not just like a perception of crime, but in reality, there is more crime when you have extremely dense, unmaintained tree cover in areas, or like shrub cover, things like that.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Katie Rose. Kind of riffing off of that just a little bit, the second finding was that people who indicated that they didn't have enough tree cover already in their neighborhood, which was a separate question, we just asked folks subjectively, do you have enough tree cover? Those respondents who said that they did not have adequate tree cover already reported feeling less safe, so just lower on the spectrum of safety, than those who said that they had enough tree cover in their neighborhoods already. Next, we asked residents where they'd like to see more trees, and every group ranked street trees at the top. Residents with inadequate neighborhood tree cover, so who indicated to us that they didn't have enough in their neighborhoods, they put new trees around homes in second place. we asked folks where they wanted new trees, and we offered 4 options. So street trees, at home, commercial sites, and parking lots were the others, and those were consistently ranked 3rd and 4th across groups. And then finally, we found that when it comes to resident preferences on tree characteristics, residents prefer trees that support bird habitat, followed by trees that are large in size, native, low maintenance, and drought resistant. So we did have a question that tested around 10 more aesthetic characteristics of trees, and characteristics that ranked quite low were things like being evergreen, providing privacy, and a noise buffer. So we wanted to test this to better understand what sorts of trees do what residents want, and what are they more likely to buy into around volunteering to maintain, for instance, or be willing to purchase themselves if given an opportunity to do so. So I wanted just to gather a couple other items into one slide here. Since our survey results were representative, in some ways, but not all, I'm highlighting here some key results for groups who were well represented in our survey and who stand to benefit from a healthy tree canopy. So this just kind of reiterates what we've talked about, but I'll say it here. The least wealthy respondents rank extreme heat mitigation at least as high or higher than air pollution. By age, extreme heat reduction is valued at least as highly by the oldest and the youngest respondents as air pollution mitigation. For those households with children or seniors, extreme heat mitigation is the most valuable service. And finally, those households that report having both asthma and another respiratory illness rank extreme heat reduction as the most valuable. So these were the recommendations that our project landed on as a whole. This engagement work mingled with the other 2 project tasks to come to this, and I'll pause so you can read them. And I do want to draw your attention to the last one, which is that we should consider these results a baseline because more work is needed. And this last one does lead me to my last slide. So this engagement, it gives us a baseline understanding of resident experiences and opinions of the trees in their neighborhood. It's a start, but it's imperfect and more work is definitely needed. So in addition to incorporating the lessons learned on the outreach slide, future research can look like any or all of these points. So first, as a reminder, our project identified hot spots in Durham that can benefit environmentally and socially from a healthy tree canopy. These areas were Bragtown, Downtown, South Square, and the neighborhoods surrounding NC Central. Second, it's important to take the time and make the investment to listen and learn about what's already going on, especially in these neighborhoods as future work contemplates deep dives. Durham is a very active community, as you all know, with activists and concerns that range from hyperlocal to global, especially given the number of new residents from other countries. So building relationships on the terms of these community members is essential and does take time. Learning what their existing vision of their community is and what they're already doing to achieve it, I think will help anyone working in the environment space to understand the value that this kind of work brings and how best to work together. And finally, there's a lot of research that shows that online engagement excludes large portions of the community. And we saw this in our experience too, with the much higher, we had a much higher response rate online, but it was much more homogeneous. In-person surveys yielded more demographically representative results, but there's a caveat. The surveyor or the interviewer should be someone trusted by that community, and they need to have the right tools to engage. So in our case, we always had a trusted connection to the group that we were surveying, a personal connection of a leader of that group who could, vouch for us in that case. But for many reasons, our surveyors were not the same race or ethnicity as the respondents, or our surveyors were grad students with limited history in Durham. Our surveyors didn't speak Spanish. I believe we had trouble actually capitalizing on that trust, and our survey results did suffer in a way. So one way that this could be overcome is to oversample these key groups in the future. But Martin, I did like your idea about the opportunity with enough time to bring folks more integrated in these groups to become actual interviewers of a given effort. So that covers the material I had prepared for today. So I'd love to hear any other questions that you all might have, or other thoughts on how you would improve a project like this. Thanks.
I'm waving my hands too.
So one of the things that is really interesting is this is like a microcosm of the Durham Engage effort. And they are struggling with the same things, like their initial results, and they did a ton of in-person sessions with babysitting and Spanish translation, and still oversampled or undersampled, African American communities, Spanish speaking communities, things like that. So I think that this is a big challenge. And I'm also surprised that we didn't get enough data from, our outreach into like these communities to balance the other folks.
Yeah, one thing I would share is in my first year of my grad program, I worked with the City of Durham Stormwater Department to implement a resident survey around an Ellerby Creek stormwater installation that they had beautiful signs up when I moved here, and nothing has happened on it for 2 years, but they were facing the same issues where they needed to demonstrate that they were engaging the community in a meaningful way. And so a few of us students were able to join on that effort. And we only did an in-person survey. We only focused on traditionally underrepresented groups. And we had a very small sample, like 100 respondents. But we did achieve a demographically representative result. But that was by essentially ignoring some of the traditional strongholds of environment and wealth in Durham. So it was by having such a narrow scope that we were able to achieve it. And that was an interesting lesson that I think both us and the Stormwater Department learned. How scalable that is, I'm not sure, because you're right, it's very difficult to hit those numbers and get a meaningful result.
I mean, is it a good idea to ignore people so that you get this?
It probably depends in part on your opinion about past decisions. I think that there could be an argument that past decisions around the urban form have favored one group at the expense of another. And so there's some balancing that needs to take place. But that's only one way of thinking. I think that aiming for fairness is another strategy. What I think is interesting about this research is that it shows that demographics is only one way to slice the pie, that we can also look at social outcomes, and which are intrinsically tied to race and income. And that did give us a representative window. So you don't want to cop out of the question of race, especially in a place like Durham that has a history of redlining and a present of immigration challenges. But it's a question that every researcher should wrestle with.
It sort of feels like if it's so easy to get white and wealthy folks to do things online, you do like the online and send it out, and you spend like 90% of your resources on sampling those folks who you can't access online in order to get more balance.
Yeah, you make a good point that I think one way we could have done things differently is to close the online version earlier and worked in person until we had the same number of in-person responses as online, because that they reach different groups for sure.
I guess I'm just wary about cutting out Like, I think we should have as many white, wealthy, or whatever people answer as who want to answer, and also like put most of our effort into getting the folks who traditionally don't answer, at least so you can get a representative sample of that group that traditionally doesn't answer, you know, because then you could almost do like a parallel analysis. I don't want to exclude a group to make up for like a past problem. I'd rather have more effort putting in to make sure that the sample we get of like the African American community is representative of the African American community and not just like the 10 people we happen to reach.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right.
It makes me squirm a little bit to think that we would exclude people to make up for excluding people.
Yeah, I think that's a fair approach. And one thing I'll note is that there are some specific numbers to hit where you want to test for significance. So like if you hit 1,079 or something respondents, you can draw conclusions from the full population regardless of representativeness from a statistical standpoint. But even at the, and Katie Rose, I don't even remember if you recall this, but even at the start of this engagement effort, our initial goal, talking with statisticians, was 1% of our population, which would have been of the vote, like population over the age of 18, which would have been like 200 to 250 people. So an argument could have been made that once we hit that number, we could have also closed it and said, this is our sample. I think that, yeah, there are a lot of ways to slice it, and it's just not black and white,
so to speak.
Yeah, right.
Did you talk at all, or did you get any information or insights on financial aspects of the whole thing in terms of, I don't know, priorities for public spending? Where do trees actually rank? Willingness to pay, or anything like that?
We didn't, but that, I think if I were around to do another round, that's what I would focus on, is the willingness to pay and the rankings of how paying for the public good of environmental aspects ranks within it. And I think that's in our report. And so we've encouraged Katie Rose to consider bringing on another round of students in future years to work on that. Yeah.
Grace, I already put together another proposal, but
awesome.
If you have some recommendations, maybe we can meet offline and you can give me like some specific things, because we are also looking to hire someone from NC Central to do another project. So we would have one at Duke and one at NC Central.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Let me ask you this: since you blew past the statistically significant number needed to represent Durham, did you get enough responses from the non-white respondents that could represent that could statistically significantly represent that cohort of Durham?
I'm just going to do some arithmetic here. So we received about 167 non-white respondents. So pretty close. Yeah.
Okay.
Not quite, but pretty close.
Well, but that would, so 200 would be statistically significant for all Durham.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And so by getting over 120, you're reaching statistically significant proportion. So like you could analyze what that group said and say like, this is representative of like non-white Durham residents' thoughts in general. Is that valid to say?
I think you could. I would hesitate toward like running statistical tests that test for significance, but we could do more like cross tabulations, for instance, that don't quite make the claim of this is representative from a mathematical standpoint, but still demonstrates that we're doing that analysis. And I think in the report, I do run a few of those tests and don't find a difference. Yeah. Interest when segmenting the responses to our key questions based on white versus non-white, there's not a noticeable difference in responses, which tells me that it could be the way the questions were asked. It could be other confounding factors. It could be it could be that the health outcomes are changing this, or it could be income, for instance, because where the income was not correlated with race. You know, we had wealthy people of all races answering, we had non-wealthy people of all races answering.
Which I think is good, because I got yelled at, rightfully so, for conflating communities of color with like poor communities.
Yeah.
They're wealthy people of all races and poor people of all races. I wanted to just show this. This is from the Triangle Resiliency Report, and this is showing vulnerability to extreme heat, which everyone identified as the top issue, it seems like, except for those folks who have respiratory illnesses who identified pollution. And so, but if you look at it, it also kind of tags along the treeless areas and the areas that are higher density population and are red line districts for the most part. I mean, you see a cutout here. That must be Duke University.
Yeah,
anyway,
I think so.
Which is
what's it define the vulnerability to extreme heat? Is that like a health, basically a health variable?
So this particular report, Martin, if you want to really geek out, it's like 300 pages. This is the like 60-page executive summary, but it overlays extreme heat incidences with folks who have these asthma or other
I see. Okay.
children, elder asthma, or poverty level.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the health issues would be in the social vulnerability part, and then the other one is just the temperature.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really hard to truthfully separate the extreme heat and pollution from asthma, because a lot of asthma is environmentally mitigated, whether it's from toxic mold inside houses, from poorly obtained houses, or it's from living within, they call it like the death corridor, which is 150 feet from a road, a busy road. And so when in Durham, the highways were put through historically African-American communities, so densities of African-American folks to this day live in like that death corridor of essentially diesel exhaust from 147, 5501, things like that. So that's why in the first thing that Grace showed, those hot spots for planting are super critical, and also probably why like Hayti looks at 147, you know, and like that whole neighborhood is like literally downwind of 147, and so that might be one of the reasons why